But you can also have a contractionary policy. So it means that lowering G, and then what happens with aggregate demand? Aggregate demand will decrease. And then what happens with Q? Q will decrease and the unemployment rate will rise, right? But the aim of contractionary fiscal policy will not be this one. It will be to lower the inflation rate, to get the economy out of the inflation rate. So we will focus on both of these policies when the economy is in a recessionary gap and in inflationary gap. Then you will see what is the effect of it on aggregate demand and also on real GDP and on the unemployment rate. Okay, so you need to be able to illustrate it. So you must go back to the Keynesian model and just look at what Keynes was saying, and then just go to exhibit 2 in your textbook on page 240. That 2 exhibits are very important. Right? So firstly, we're going to look at, according to Keynes, the economy might be stuck in a recessionary gap. The reasons he mentioned that is because wages might be inflexible downwards, prices might not change, and interest rates might be inflexible, right? Or interest rates might be responsive not to interest rates but to other factors like the level of income and business expectations about the future. So let's look at the economy in a recessionary gap, and then we will, according to Keynes. This is not according to the self-regulating economy, right? So let's look at price level and then the real GDP, which is Q. So then you draw your aggregate demand curve, 81. Okay. Then you draw your short run aggregate supply curve, SRA is 1. Okay. Then where 81 intersects SRA is 1, there is short run equilibrium at Q1. Okay, so the economy is here at short run equilibrium. Then we draw your LRAS curve, which is to the right, because the economy is in a recessionary gap, reducing Qn, the natural real GDP. Okay, so what will now happen? Will the economy be able to move from number 1 or to number 2 or whatever? What will happen now? So what must the government do now according to Keynes? They must follow what we call an expansionary fiscal policy. What do we mean by that? An increase in government expenditure and or a decrease in taxation. Now what effect will that have on the aggregate demand curve? The aggregate demand curve will shift where? To the right, because now government expenditure increase, so aggregate demand will also increase. So what happens now with aggregate demand? It increases or move to the right, so it will intersect at that point to 82. And then the economy will move from the short run equilibrium, from the recessionary gap, to point 2, the long run equilibrium, producing the natural real GDP. Now this is what the economy didn't self-regulate itself, like in chapter 9. The increase in government expenditure and or taxation, expansionary fiscal policy, led to an increase in aggregate demand, and that moved the economy back to long run equilibrium. Don't get confused about this 2 dash point here. It's just to confuse you. Ignore it, because if the economy is self-regulating, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Remember, wages will decrease, there's a surplus on the labor market, and then the SRAS curve will move by itself to here and intersect at 2 dash. But that is not according to Keynes, so please ignore 2 dash. You're only interested in what Keynes was saying. Okay? Right, so that is the economy from a recessionary gap. When the economy is in an inflationary gap, let's draw it quickly. Short run aggregate supply 1 and 81, and then that is where the economy is now at Q1. And if the economy is in inflationary gap, the real GDP will be greater than the natural real GDP, so the LRAS curve will be here, Qn, LRAS curve. Okay, so we are at point number 1 now. Again, ignore 2 dash, because that is what is self-regulating. They just put it there so that we can compare the self-regulating economy with the Keynesian view of the economy. Now, if the economy is in inflationary gap, it means that what will governments then do according to Keynes? They will apply a contractionary fiscal policy. That means they will increase government expenditure and or increase taxation. Or they will use either this one or that one separately. Okay, now what is the effect on aggregate demand? If there's an decrease in government expenditure, increase in taxation, aggregate demand will decrease. And then the real GDP will also decrease. Okay, so remember we assume that we're in the horizontal part of the AS curve. So the price level we don't even look at because we assume that it remained constant, right? Okay, so what happens here now is important. What happens with the aggregate demand curve? It will now shift to the left because there's a decrease in aggregate demand because of the contractionary fiscal policy, and the economy will move from the short run equilibrium to the long run equilibrium because of the contractionary fiscal policy according to Keynes. So we will produce again at QN. Okay, can you see now what we looked at now is Keynes said that the economy will be stuck in a recessionary gap. And then what must then happen according to Keynes is that the government must apply expansionary fiscal policy to get the economy out of the recessionary gap back to long run equilibrium. And we have just illustrated what will happen with the aggregate demand curve. And if there's an inflationary gap, the government needs to apply contractionary fiscal policy to get the economy out of that inflationary gap. Okay. So, yeah, this is important. What we need to focus now on, you see there's a lot of explanation now because we have tackled now chapter 10 and chapter 11. What still remains in chapter 11 is what Keynes was proposing, the expansionary fiscal policy and increasing the aggregate demand so that it can lead to higher real GDP and low unemployment. In the real world, it might not work. Expansionary fiscal policy might be there might be obstacles, and aggregate demand might not even increase, or it might not increase, and get the economy out of the recessionary gap to long run equilibrium. Now, the two problems that is identified in this chapter now, is there might be what we call crowding out taking place, or there's also lags, and this is explained next. Crowding out or lags that might take place in the economy. And before I continue, I know it's been a long session now, we will just explain now what is crowding out and the different types of crowding out, and you must be able to illustrate it in a diagram. It's a simple diagram, and then for the exam there are different types of lags. There are 5 different types of lags on page 243 and 244. You just need to be able to mention the lags and briefly explain it, so it's possible questions. And then we need to look at fiscal policy from the supply side, where the government can lower the marginal tax rate and try to stimulate the economy from the supply side. So there's a diagram, what is the effect if that happens? And then we will look at what we call the Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve illustrates the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. And this curve you must be able to draw. I just ask it for the residential students in the semester test, and just briefly explain the Laffer curve. So I think we just need a 5-minute break, and then I will start in 5 minutes and then complete the last part of chapter 11, and very, very critical for the exam. And then in the last section we will just chapter 12, not much to because we only do certain things in chapter 12, and then chapter 13 in your textbook is replaced by the notes on the Moodle site, and I gave you on the South African Reserve Bank, because they discuss the Central Bank of America, which is called the Federal Reserve. Now, we don't live in America, we live in South Africa. Okay, I hope that you are still with me, because I know it's a lot of information, but if we relate it to microeconomics, the opportunity cost of attending this ITV session is very high. Thank you.